Hey, this is Zero at ReviewZoneHD, and I'm bringing you as a review for Bioshock Infinite for the PlayStation 3. There's been a lot of really good titles that have already released in the first 3 months of this year, but this very well could be the best title that's released so far, and it's already gathering Game of the Year discussions. As of today, it would certainly be my choice. There's only been 2 other titles on this channel that I've reviewed that were so good that doing a review for them was almost pointless, which those 2 titles were Batman Arkham City and Skyrim, and I would place Bioshock Infinite into that same group. For those that snagged an early PS3 copy of the game, you also get the original Bioshock on the disc, which holds a PS3 Metacritic score of 94, tying it for the 8th spot on the all-time scoring list. With 17 reviews turned in so far, Bioshock Infinite is holding a 95. Game Informer, which is one of the very few review companies that I respect, gave the game a perfect score, and even taking a glance at user scores across the internet, most gamers have universally scored this title about as high as you can. For me personally, I'm not exactly sure where I would place it in my all-time favorites for the PS3, but it would certainly be my favorite first-person shooter. It's kind of tough to review a title that you couldn't find that many faults with, but with that said, let's go ahead and get into the review. This is usually the area that I piss and moan about technical issues, but the few that are actually in this game are very, very minor. There were a couple occasions that the girl that you're escorting teleported around in an odd manner, but it was more funny than an actual irritation. Frame rate wise, the game ran very smooth, and I never had any issues with the environment, such as getting stuck in an object or having any trouble traveling around, which that in itself is a pretty big accomplishment because of the zipline rail system that's used to move around the city. This roller coaster like way of getting around gives a real sense of speed and motion that few games can match. The way this title presents fog and sunlight is just downright spectacular, as some areas almost feel dreamlike as you're walking amongst the clouds. The lighting effect from the sunlight causes some areas to have a bright golden glow that fades the closer that you get, and other darker areas will sometimes have sunbeams shining through the windows that gives almost a sense of warmth as you're passing through it. Everything about the environment and the enemies feel larger than life, and the grand scale of the floating city is impressive enough to creep into your dreams at night. The only 2 gripes that I have with the graphics are the textures will sometimes load in as you draw closer, which most games of this size do that, and the lip syncing could have been polished a little bit more.
Hey! You talking to yourself again? Man, I worry about your sanity sometimes.
Bioshock Infinite presents a standalone story that you won't need to play either of the first 2 titles in the series to understand or enjoy. Some of the dialogue can be a bit provocative when it comes to race and religion, but almost all of it has a good point with underlying themes of political and social issues that relate to today's world, even if the game revolves around the year 1912. The story is extremely entertaining, but even if you're the type of gamer that has an itchy trigger finger that just wants to focus on the action and you don't care for storylines, you're still going to have an absolute blast playing through this game. I generally fall into that category of I don't care about the story, especially in shooters, but there's enough character development, awesome voice acting that sounds believable, and great storytelling to have kept me entertained even when I was ready to go rumbling through the action. Without spoiling anything, I will say the game ends on a bit of a cliffhanger and has its fair share of twists along the way. The discussions and interactions between your character and Elizabeth are just as good as the high-flying action set pieces and shootouts, if not better. No matter what your viewpoint is on the game itself, it's hard to deny it has one of the best stories and settings for a first-person shooter ever made. For those familiar with my channel, I do love sniping in games, and the sniper rifle on Bioshock Infinite is flawlessly perfect. Quick sniping, long range, side swipes, whatever your style of preferred aiming is, this game accommodates for it. The way your character moves around feels better than most shooters, and the actual aiming sensitivity is spot on. There's a perfect balance of acceleration and deceleration when pointing and moving in or out of the scope. I personally am not very good with iron-sighted weapons on most games, but even those felt pretty accurate for me. As good as the controls are, I'm sure some were disappointed that multiplayer was cancelled for this title, especially after Bioshock 2 had a pretty decent online community still playing that game long after it released. I spent some time online with Bioshock 2 and I thought it was actually pretty fun, but once you sit down and start playing through most of this game, any disappointment with that missing feature should fade away. Throughout the entire game, you're building a very realistic bond with your sidekick Elizabeth, who you're pretty much coping and adapting to one another as the escalating situations play out. Luckily, you never have to worry about actually protecting her or receiving a game over because she takes a dirt nap. She was programmed perfectly, staying out of the way and off to the side, only occasionally popping up during combat sequences to toss you some ammo or call out an incoming enemy. And just quickly off topic, is it just me or does Elizabeth remind you of Alice in Wonderland, Madness Returns? Just a passing thought. One of my subscribers said it best, that games are starting to rival movies when it comes to storytelling and getting you immersed into the experience, and this game couldn't be a better example of that. When you break this game down into individual categories such as sound, graphics, gameplay, fun factor, and value, it really doesn't have many weaknesses, and it's brilliant across the board. It's still pretty early to make any predictions, but I would be very surprised if this isn't a strong contender for Game of the Year when everything's said and done in about 8 months. If you're not a fan of the previous 2 Bioshocks or even first-person shooters in general, there's enough substance to look past any hang-ups that you may have with this game or this series, and I highly recommend at the very least checking out some more gameplay if you're even the slightest bit interested in playing this title. It's definitely worthy of a day one purchase unless you have an issue with the gory and graphic nature that's found in this game, which it can be pretty brutal at times. The story is also trippy enough that you'll most likely want to play through the game twice, and for those wanting more of a challenge, there's a harder difficulty waiting for you to unlock after completing the game once. If you're on the fence about buying this one, I would definitely say go ahead and pick it up. 99% of you won't be disappointed that you did. Anyways, this is Zero at ReviewZoneHD, and thanks for stopping by.